Let's talk about some armoured superiority, big guns, and the mightiest fighting vehicles in Warhammer 40k, with an overview of the best tank for each army in the game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking armoured tank spearheads, and looking through each army in the game currently, talking through which ones might be the strongest for each faction to field. In 10th edition, I'd argue that probably tanks as a class have gained a little bit more power overall. There were certainly some very strong ones in 9th edition, but a fair few of them tended to struggle to compete with infantry with big core buffs from characters, a lot of which vehicles were excluded from. In 10th edition though, there's a few things that have really helped them out quite a bit. Certainly the skewed toughness chart helps really quite a lot. Plenty of small arms or lighter units in melee just won't really be able to scratch tanks all that much, and even lots of medium strength weapons will struggle a lot more than they did before. Plasma at strength 8 and Melter at strength 9 might struggle to wound their armoured bulkheads. Otherwise, I think being able to shoot out of melee is really quite an important thing for tanks that are running up the board and not just getting bogged down in cheap chaff. They can still have their biggest guns trained on the things that are most important. And the new objective control system I think helps them out a little bit as well. At least tanks have a little bit more threat on objectives versus infantry, not just literally counting as one model and even then being outscored by objectives secured if that even matters. Armoured fighting vehicles in Warhammer 40k come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. For this video I want to try and focus more on tanks than on things like walkers and mixed role things that fight in combat as well, though plenty of factions have borderline cases all over the shop. To try and narrow the focus a little bit, I thought for this one I'd mainly focus on tough vehicles that are primarily focused on range damage, and try and look a little bit more as to things that deal direct damage to the enemy rather than indirect fire, though I will mention a few of those as they crop up for the relevant factions. In any case, let's jump into it, talk through each army in Warhammer 40k, one of the best candidates for the strongest tank that they can bring to the board, and what makes them good. First up, for the Space Marines, I think there's a fairly strong case for the Gladiator Lancer at 145 points. This thing spent the vast majority of 9th edition being very underwhelming with its gun stats, but in 10th edition it seems to have got the glow up that it deserves. The Laser Destroyer is now fairly fearsome against vehicles, 2 attacks at a great big 72-inch range, strength 14, AP 4 and damage d6 plus 3, enough to get through the high armour saves and likely cover saves of a lot of armour in 10th edition. It'd be a fairly unreliable profile without its rerolls, but it's got some Aquilon optics allowing it to reroll a hit, wound and damage roll, and it also natively hits on a 2+ as well, which certainly helps. Its turn-on-turn average is really quite impressive against vehicles. Against things with a 3+ save without an invulnerable save or cover, you'd expect an average of around about 10 wounds turn-on-turn out of one of these. Obviously it's very swingy depending on how you roll, and cover, higher saves and invulnerables will make it a bit worse. Still though, for 145 points on a fairly mobile platform at long range, that seems very good to me. Plus it does actually have a fair amount of backup systems as well, some storm bolters, a heavy stubber and an Icarus pod, so if enemy infantry do get too close it could hopefully handle a few of them at least. Its durability is kind of fine for the cost as well, 12 wounds at toughness 10 with a 3+ save, and hopefully range enough to outrange some of the enemy. Otherwise I think there's a fair few choices for strong Space Marine armour right now. The Repulsor is very impressive at less than 200 points with the guns that it's covered in, plus its transport tricks. The Repulsor Executioner pays an extra 30 points over that to mount a really big gun, which I think is fair enough. The Gladiators Reaper and Valiant are both good as well against either close-range tanks or anti-infantry, and though it's a bit more of an indirect fire artillery piece, the Whirlwind I still think is worth a shout at 150 points. Still pretty savage, ignores line of sight firepower, particularly with Oath of Moment if you can spare it, a big threat to kill things like medium infantry that other units like Primaris Desolation Squads might struggle to crack. For the Imperial Guard, the way that Games Workshop's balanced them at the moment has most of their tanks looking really quite expensive, I must admit. A bit of a come down from how strong and dangerous the Leman Russ was in 9th edition, and certainly a lot less support from the Codex. If I had to pick a strongest tank at the moment, it'd probably be the Leman Russ Demolisher, though perhaps with others like the Rogol Dawn and the Leman Russ Exterminator both being pretty interesting as well, though they all have competition from the Artillery and the Sentinels. I think the Leman Russ Demolisher seems like really quite a good one just in terms of the raw threat that it has though. It does have a short range, but it easily outcompetes a bunch of the others at plenty of targets in 40k. D6 plus 3 shots at strength 14, AP 3 and damage 6 is pretty much something that most things are going to be scared of. Really quite efficient against heavy armour and stacked saves. Combat that up with some multi-melters or plasma cannons, or maybe heavy flamers if you want some good overwatch, plus a hunter-killer missile and pintle-mounted stubber. The Demolisher's special rule is that it gets to fire in melee with blast weapons and can also do so without penalty as well. Perhaps a particularly nice benefit for this thing that's always had its Achilles heel being locked up in combat and then having its really big scary gun being made useless. Durability wise for the cost, I'd say it's okay but not super standout. 13 wounds at toughness 11 and a 2+ save I think is good, particularly with how easy it is to get cover in 10th edition these days, but for 220 points it is a little bit less so. Otherwise for the Imperial Guard though, I think there are some strong contenders for the top tank spot. The Rogue Dawn battle tank is quite usable I think, not really all that much more than the Demolisher and does pack an awful lot of guns, and the Leman Russ Exterminator has a damage output that's alright, but gets that very nice debuff of an extra AP against a unit that it shoots, and that could be really quite a big deal for focusing firepower with your entire gun line, never mind just that tank. In reality, for armoured fighting vehicles just for raw efficiency, Scout Sentinels are kind of hard to pass up at the moment. Some firepower with some hunter-killer missiles, fairly crazy defense, and the ability to recycle the unit for 2 CP, all of which are pretty scary. And then, of course, mass artillery with basilisks and manticores does seem to be one of the strongest ways to play guard right now, for better or worse. For sheer competitiveness, that probably outcompetes the Leman Russ Demolisher per the point, if you are counting them more as tanks as opposed to artillery pieces. Moving on, for the Adeptus Mechanicus, we've got the Scorpius Disintegrator, 195 points for this Adeptus Mechanicus hover gun tank, and maybe one of the better ways to deal with enemy heavy targets, particularly monsters, that things like Cataphrons with the arc rifles might struggle to hurt. I have seen a few people choosing to have one or two of these float around in the backfields of slightly more honed Adeptus Mechanicus lists these days. They seem to be at least a little bit more played than the Onager Dunecrawler. Toughness wise, again I'd say they're okay but not standout for 195 points. Toughness 10, 12 wounds and a 2+ save is at least fairly sturdy, particularly as you should hopefully be able to get cover with this thing quite easily, as it can stay fairly far off, but still things like las cannons will make it melt fast enough. For its primary armament, the Ephemerite cannon seeing a lot more play than the Belleros energy cannon, 3 attacks at strength 12, AP 3 and damage d6, with a +1 to hit against vehicles or monsters. The disruptor missiles work quite well in tandem with that as well. 3 attacks at strength 9, AP 2 and damage d6, but they do get twin linked so they get to reroll wound rolls, very nice if they're punching up against something with a greater toughness than their strength. For a bit of defense, they've got triple heavy stubbers for up to 18 anti-infantry shots up close. They have the chance to farm command points on a 5+, say if you use that return fire stratagem on it, and the Doctrina imperatives can either give it the assault or heavy keyword on all of its guns each turn, both of which could be potentially helpful, the heavy for the disruptor missiles, and the assault for being able to zip around the board a bit faster and gain some line of sight. You could potentially invest an engine seer in it as well to give it a 4+ invulnerable save and a bit of healing. I think that seems reasonable enough as it's quite a high investment tank now. Overall I can see why it sees play, though obviously Adeptus Mechanicus as a faction need a lot of help at the moment. They are one of the weakest armies in the game. Moving on to the Golden Boys, and for the Adeptus Custodes, they only really have one choice in the Caladius Grav tank, but as luck would have it for them, it's a very good one. For 215 points, this one's got a very solid durability, toughness 11, a 2+ save with a 5+ invulnerable, and 14 wounds. I must admit it does seem a little surprising for the Caladius to both have equal toughness and more wounds than a Leman Russ Demolisher these days. It gets some seriously powerful shooting, hitting on the Custodes signature ballistic skill of 2+. Probably my favourite out of the 2 turret weapon options are the big anti-tank one with 4 attacks at strength 12, AP 3 and damage d6 +2. It also has twin linked as well, so if you land any hits on your target, which you're kind of likely to, you'd be wounding toughness 12 armor light knights most of the time. With that one you also get lethal hits against monsters and vehicles as well, to even increase further the amount of wounds you're going to get. Otherwise, the secondary option is 8 attacks rapid fire at closer range with strength 10, AP 1 and damage 3, again twin linked. That one's the twin Iliastus Accelerator Cannon, and that one gets lethal hits against anything that isn't a vehicle or monster, rather than everything that is. Really quite nice for the Custodes to have some fast-moving, strong fire support. I think it works quite well with the rest of the army, which tends to be very slow and very tanky, and be able to chew through most elite infantry in melee. These guys can reach out and hurt threats that otherwise they might struggle to take down. As a secondary weapon, it's also got some Lastrum bolt carbines as well, just to stack a few damage one-shots on something that needs them. These guys really do seem to be the fire support for Adeptus Custodes at the moment. Both the Bikes and the Telemon Dreadnought seem to be significantly further behind the Caladiuses. I guess the Land Raider could be another option for strongest tank, I suppose. I feel like in general for the Custodes though, they don't really need the transport all that badly. They've got the raw durability just to slog their way up the board, and they do have some ways of getting advance and charge as well. A Blade Champion could deliver a unit to combat really quite a long way across the board. Grey Knights certainly aren't a faction that are really known for their tanks, and I feel like the correct amount of tanks that you might want to run in a Grey Knight army might well be 0. I guess in terms of true tank chassis, we only really have the Land Raider and Razorback to choose from. After the two, I might be a little bit more tempted by the Land Raider, I suppose. It could deliver a unit to actually charge really quite a long way away. A lot of Grey Knight's teleport tricks might help them get close to the enemy, but still any charges might be kind of risky besides one from Drago maybe. I guess perhaps Purifiers or some Terminators or Strike Marines could be reasonable enough to have in there, though it is pretty pricey for the cost of admission, and it doesn't really do much with the faction's core rules. Grey Knights certainly aren't looking the strongest at the moment despite their powerful teleport tricks, but tank spearheads probably aren't the way to make them work. I suppose the Land Raider could at least chip in with a little bit of anti-armour, which they do struggle with. Moving on, for the Sisters of Battle, we have the Castigator tank. Weirdly, some of the Sisters of Battle lists I've been seeing these days look rather armour heavy. A lot of their traditionally strong units in 9th edition that dealt a lot of damage like Retributors and Repentia are struggling to be quite as effective in 10th. I think that all three of the unique Sisters armour units are usable. The Castigator, Exorcist and Immolator. I'd perhaps put the Castigator just a little bit ahead, though the AP -1 is a little bit sad for it. Toughness wise, for 150 points I think it's okay. T10, 11 wounds, a 3+ save with a 6+ invulnerable, somewhat middling. And for weapons it blazes away with a trio of heavy bolters, which are quite effective against light and medium infantry, plus a storm bolter and a hunter-killer missile. Hunter-killer missiles are at least fairly scary these days. For its main weapon you either have the choice of the Castigator autocannon or the battle cannon. The autocannon either gets you 4 or 8 shots, strength 9, AP1 and damage 3 with twin links. The battle cannon is an alternative with blast, strength 10 and ignores cover, and usually averaging around about 6 or 7 shots. I think you could make arguments for both of them really. Outside of cover, the Castigator autocannon probably wins out for the most part, but seeing as cover saves are really easy to find in 10th, I'd say perhaps the battle cannon could be the better option overall. You also get some rerolls either against infantry or vehicles and monsters, and the ability to hand out a battle shock test as well, which isn't all that helpful, but could be okay situationally. Otherwise though, for Sisters in general, I think that the other two are kind of fine. The Exorcist got put up in cost really quite a lot, but it does have fairly savage ignores line of sight shooting, and I feel like that's going to be interesting enough utility to have to a list. Could finish off crucial enemy units that are hiding out of line of sight, or chip away at squads on objectives to really mess with the opponent's whole game plan. Otherwise, I think the Immolator is solidly usable for re-rolling wound rolls for Retributors getting out of them. If you are going to try and make multi-melter Retributors work still, then that seems like really quite a good way to deliver them, both helping a bit with the range and also the low strength. Next up for the Imperial Knights, obviously they don't really have tanks as such as an entire army of walkers. If we had to talk about one unit about them though, and we didn't want to talk about one of the big knights with all the guns like the Crusader, then I guess that would leave either the Armiger Helverins or the Armiger Moiraxes as the only other major choices. Out of those two, I'd probably give it to the Armiger Helverins, who do have some pretty interesting guns still. The autocannons each spit out 4 shots at strength 9, AP -1 and damage 3. A little bit more reliability compared with the 9th edition version with the random number of shots, though they do have a little bit less AP than before, not ideal when a whole load of things get cover. It does mean that a fair few tanks and heavy infantry that they might fire against would generally be saving on a 3+ or 2+ some of the time, though with their volume fire they certainly can stack the saves. They are particularly good against certain targets though. The Helverins get anti-fly 2+ if they're either in your deployment zone or on an objective marker. That's really quite massive against some targets they might have been wounding on a 5+ before. And if you really want to punish one enemy unit with these guys, you could use that Squire's Duty stratagem for an extra AP, an extra pip of strength, and potentially even extra damage if you manage to kill the enemy warlord so far. Otherwise their firepower gets a little bit better both with the standard nightly rerolls, plus buffs from big knights like maybe a Crusader for +1 to hit. They can be at least fairly reliable little gun turrets, as well as being fairly fast with good objective control values as well. For the Moirax's part, they cost significantly more. Maybe the grav cannons seem kind of interesting as a good general purpose type gun. I'd probably go for Helverins first though, given the points difference. For the Chaos Space Marines, they do have access to a fair few tanks, but I feel like for them it's hard not to talk about the Forge Fiend. Perhaps feels like a bit more of a leggy tank than anything else. It's not one that wants to go running into melee like the Venom Crawler or Defiler, for example. In any case, I think that these things really beat the tanks at their own game, often wanting to take triple exoplasma cannons for general purpose anti-elite and anti-armor firepower. They all get the blast rule, which is very nice against infantry, whether big or small squads, and their special rule is to make them overcharge for hazardous keywords, but get devastating wounds on their attacks. On average, they get around 6 shots at strength 10, AP 3 and damage 3. They can make themselves significantly more dangerous with their choice of dart packs, either going for lethal hits to punch up against bigger vehicles, or sustained hits to get more shots. Then things get better with the mark that they choose, either Nurgle for boosted packs, so getting more lethal hits on the target, and potentially the can't shoot me stratagem at long range which could save one's life on occasion, or maybe go undivided for some small rerolls when you do packs, or the access to that stratagem for the full rerolls to hit and wound for them. That's absolutely amazing with the devastating wounds. Otherwise, both Abaddon and a Hellbrute could make them significantly shootier if you could spare one or both of them to be nearby. There's potential for doubling up on the packs, which is pretty amazing on these guys, plus Abaddon's full hit rerolls. Overall, very scary and very generalist firepower that works well against elite infantry and against vehicles. Bunches of mortal wounds never go amiss, really. I certainly would rank them significantly above the other tanks in the Chaos Codex. I guess maybe the Vindicator and the Land Raider might be the next ones that you might think about talking about. Land Raiders delivering quality Chaos melee to the fight seems alright, and the Vindicator can punch quite hard against tanks, though it does come at a price. For the Death Guard, I think that the price still goes to their iconic Plague Burst Crawler, 175 points, for a mixed tank that does both direct and indirect fire. Toughness wise, it's T10, a 2+ save with a 5+ invulnerable and 12 wounds. I'd say that's okay durability for 175 points, better than a few of the ones that we've talked about, but still, being Death Guard, I was a bit surprised that this was quite so low toughness at T10, what with durability being supposed to be their thing and all. For its damage output, you get D6+3, Strength 8, AP1 and Damage 2 hits with the Plague Burst Mortar, getting lethal hits as a plague weapon, and it can hit a fair bit harder with the Lord of Virulence if you can have one of those spotting for it. It also can hand out some battle shock tests to infantry as well, which might be more useful against some things than others. A bit of indirect is definitely helpful, and then it backs that up with either some quality anti-tank with the entropy cannons at strength 10 and damage D6+1, or potentially the Plague Spitters look like a lot more of a viable choice now. They're the Torrent Sponsons with anti-infantry 2+, and strength 6 and AP1, and in the age where Overwatch is a thing, they could be really quite a good thing to be able to access, maybe burning away an enemy infantry squad that was getting a bit too close. Overall, for the full proposition, I think it's still probably a little bit superior to things like Blight Haulers or Predator tanks, both of those perhaps being a little bit better if you just want some focused anti-armour though. The World Eaters are again maybe a faction that aren't known for their tanks so much, and I might well fall back on the trusty Land Raider for these guys. They get their variant for 255 points, so a little bit cheaper than some of the other armies out there, perhaps partly to do with their Casino of Corn Blessings abilities not really giving them all that huge benefits. I guess the plus 2-inch movement characteristic could be quite good for this, move a little bit further before getting the squad out, and then have them charging into battle. World Eaters at least have the potential to do some Alpha Strike things with units scouting into the midfield, and I guess the Land Raider could help out with that, adding another scary melee squad into the mix with really quite a long charge range. You are paying really quite a big premium to allow you to get that though. Again, doesn't seem actively bad, really quite tough with a 2+ armor and toughness 12, plus actually has some okay anti-armor range damage with the las cannons, which genuinely would help out the faction again, as they don't really have all that much shooting outside of things like allied Wardog Brigands maybe. Still probably going to be just competing with standard Rhino rushes though, and the fact that a fair few infantry can get a lot of speed going with a plus 2-inch move and advance and charge if you roll lucky on the blessings. For the Thousand Sons, I'm afraid I'm going to be very lax as to the definition of a tank here. They do have armour options like Predators and the Land Raider, but again they just seem rather unexciting. Predators and Forge Fiends both could give you some okay damage output. The Thousand Sons at least get their Forge Fiends significantly cheaper than the Chaos Space Marines, but they can't put anywhere near as many buffs on it, and it doesn't get the devastating wounds either. The Mutalith Vortex Beast is admittedly a bit more of a mixed threat. It does have some okay combat at strength 9 and damage 4, or a whole slew of anti-infantry attacks alternatively, but he also does come with some seriously scary shooting as well. I think most lists might struggle to take things like Predators or Forge Fiends over the mixed ranged and melee damage that this guy can bring. The great big warp vortex on his back can either spit out a whole bunch of anti-elite shots at strength 9, AP2 and damage 2, a single absolutely devastatingly powerful shot with one shot at strength 18, AP4 and a huge damage D6+6. It even gets devastating wounds as well. That one looks utterly terrifying if the enemy puts a heavy hitter somewhere within range. Fairly safe against that thing, and you've got a good chance of picking up a lot of medium armor vehicles out there. Then finally, and for a bit of Overwatch, you could do its Warp Vortex Torrent, 2d6 auto hits within 12 inches, at strength 6, AP1 and damage 1. Very good just for clearing hordes as it moves up the board as well. Beyond that, it also gets an aura of mortal wounds as well when it closes into the enemy, which is very nice, boosted range Kabbalistic Rituals, and is really quite tanky at toughness 10, 13 wounds and a 4+ invulnerable save. A bit easier to kill with low AP things, but a bit harder to kill with high AP things. Overall, I think it definitely fits the bill as a Thousand Suns ranged heavy. It just happens to be a massively efficient datasheet that also punches really hard in combat too. For the Chaos Knights, similarly to the Imperials, they don't really have tanks as such, being walkers. So for this one again, we'll go for one of the ranged war dogs, and I think for most people there probably wouldn't be too much competition with the war dog brigands taking the top spot here. This thing is perhaps one of the few things that the Imperials are really quite jealous of. 150 points for a very general purpose ranged fast gun turret here. It gets the rather excellent Demon Breath Spear, which is a seriously potent anti-tank weapon, a Melter weapon with Strength 12 and the Melter 4 characteristic rather than Melter 2. They definitely got through the Melter change quite well, and a Chain Cannon with Strength 6, AP-1 and Damage 1, and a big 12 shots. The Brigand also has the special rule for getting an extra pip of AP when it's targeting the closest unit as well. That's very relevant for the Chain Cannon, and certainly can be relevant for the Demon Breath Spear as well, with high saves and cover saves again being fairly common. All of those hit on a 2+, getting a boosted ballistic skill compared with the rest of the knights, and again like the Imperial ones it moves pretty quickly and has fairly good objective control when it gets to points. Overall just a really strong all-rounder, perhaps not too surprising why a lot of Chaos Knight lists are running 6 of these, they are just very good. Finally for the Chaos Demons, again a faction without really tanks as such, and for the most part they generally want to be running their greater demons winging around the board anyway. I've seen quite a lot of lists just going all in on the monster mash, things like Be'lakor, Shalaxi, Hellbane, mixed with a few of the others. I guess perhaps the single closest thing that they have to a tank is the Skull Cannon of Khorne, which I'm not sure I'd say is an absolute standout good datasheet, but it could put out some volume fire at range and chip away at enemy targets a bit. Toughness wise, for 115 points, it's T9, a 4+ invul save, and 9 wounds. Not awful with the high invulnerable, but still not standout perhaps. And the Skull Cannon shoots out D6+2 shots at strength 9, AP2, and damage 1 with blast, also handing out a battle shock test to whatever it hits. It is at least a little bit general purpose with a bunch of attacks at strength 5 or 6 and damage 2 with the Hellblades plus the bitey jaw attacks. So I suppose it's got a little bit of a mixed threat if the enemy gets close with something very light. For all that, I'm still not sure it's absolutely standout in a Chaos Demons army, and if you really desperately want some fire support, you could have some allied War Dog Brigands from the Chaos Knights if you wanted. Weirdly, it might be one where the Chaos Demons could do a bit of a trade with the Chaos Knights. They might really like some Brigands for some general purpose, fast moving gun turrets, and the Chaos Knights might actually find some good use for a Skull Cannon of Khorne. They're all about the battle shock and getting damage buffs against enemies that are battle shocks. They're perhaps one of the armies that actually cares about the battle shock test that the Skull Cannon can hand out, and if you could lay that on an enemy unit that's just about to get hit by a bunch of damage, the Skull Cannon might actually have a niche in the army. Finally, let's get onto the Xenos tank forces and spearheads, and starting out we've got the Aeldari with maybe a fairly easy one to rate in the Fire Prism at 150 points. Kind of hilarious that these things used to be 125 points, and they still seem to be making their appearance in a whole ton of Aeldari lists out there. They're very fast, have enormous anti-tank firepower, some powerful tricks and cool special rules. The base chassis maybe isn't anything enormous to write home about. It's only toughness 9, 12 wounds and a 3+ save, so easier to kill than many. It does have a good move characteristic though, and the potential to stay safe with Aeldari movement stratagem shenanigans. If it does get to hit you first, which I think most of the time they usually will, then they strike with a prism cannon at 60-inch range, 2 attacks at strength 18, AP-4 and damage 6, and between its own crystal targeting rerolls plus the Aeldari battle host ones, is usually going to be rerolling all hits and all wounds, so it's just massively reliable. The gun also has a linked fire mode as well, which means that if you take multiple fire prisms and they can see each other, then they can all draw line of sight from the one that's got the best position to shoot at the enemy. It means you could maybe have one fire prism actually go quite adventurous and try and get some creative lines of sight on the foe, or you could play a bit cagier and have your fire prisms mainly hidden behind cover, and maybe just have one of them expose themselves to the enemy, perhaps before using fire and phase to hide back out of line of sight again. You might be able to fire at no prisms, and then they've all just shot at you. If there's no heavy armour, then it's still not wasted as well. 2d6, strength 6, AP-1 and damage 2 attacks can chip in at least, plus a shuriken cannon. It is at least fairly general purpose, although I definitely think it's most standout in blasting away enemy armour. I think I still certainly rate the Fire Prism as the strongest, even with the points increased to 150. The Night Spinner is also quite nice though, with its indirect shooting. The Falcon and the Lynx I think are both alright, and perhaps for direct anti-armour firepower things like Hornets and War Walkers also compete quite well, but they don't really feel like grav tanks in the same way I think. For the Drukhari, the nearest thing that they get to a tank is the Ravager, Cheap and effective Dark Lances at the moment at 95 points, weirdly now being one of the strongest things about the faction. Massive anti-tank Dark Lance firepower seeming to be one of the best ways that they have to go. And if they are allowing you to field Ravagers at 95 points for 3 absolutely murderous anti-tank shots that you potentially can buff, including a trio of these seems very, very reasonable in most lists. They move 14 inches and don't have that strong a defense. They're only toughness 9 with a 4+ save and a 6+ invulnerable and 11 wounds. I'd say that's kind of mediocre but not downright bad when they're this cheap. It does mean that things like autocannons will kill them fast though. Their damage output is definitely the main draw to them. 3 attacks at 36 inches, hitting on a 3+ at strength 12, AP 3 and a big damage d6 +2. Pretty murderous anti-tank firepower there, and as an added bonus for their opening salvos, they get to reroll 1s to hit against a unit that's at starting strength. If you did happen to have some pain tokens going, and the main thing that you needed out of your army was some tanks dealt with as well, you can always feed them into these guys for yet more damage output. Next up we've got the Tyranids, and for their victory out of their biggest living tank, I think it would either be between the Tyrannifex and the Exocrine, both of which I think I could have fairly happily ranked in first place. Starting with the Tyrannifex, it's 200 points, has very big durability and toughness 12, a 2+ save and 16 wounds, and it has -1 damage as well, so it's a very sturdy threat to stomp into the midfield. It's alright on objectives as well with OC5, not good to outcompete entire squads of enemy battle line units, but it could be big enough to outmuscle certain depleted squads. If you wanted to make its durability yet more ridiculous, you could use that stratagem on it for 5+ feel no pain, potentially for free if there was a Hive Tyrant nearby. The most common loadout for the Tyrannifex is the Acid Spray in competitive lists these days. D6+6 shots at strength 6, AP -2 and damage 2 at 18-inch range in the midfield. I do think that as main weapons go, it's maybe not the single most outstanding big gun. This thing's definitely more tough than it is dangerous, but that is going to handle the vast majority of medium infantry squads really quite quickly, and it's quite a big Overwatch threat as well if the opponent moves forward. It could be losing an entire squad at a time if this thing rolls well. It does have some stinger salvos as well for some strength 5, and a little bit of threat in combat, though nothing serious. The other loadout, if you wanted more anti-armour in your life, would be the Rupture Cannon. 2 shots at strength 18, AP -4 and damage 2d6. Really quite strong and dangerous that one, but very, very swingy. Plus you would have to weigh up between shooting more accurately and being on the move as it has heavy. Otherwise, the other bug that I'd rate around about the same sort of level would be the Exocrine. Realistically, I think if you're fielding many big monsters of the same sort, probably mass Exocrines would be better than mass Tyrannifexes, though I think that they're both good. The Exocrine's far cheaper at 135 points, mass strength 8, AP 3 and damage 3 shots, plus it lights up the target a bit to make other Tyranid shooting better against that same unit. Definitely really nice general purpose, very good against infantry, and can be a threat to tanks, particularly if you've got lethal hits on the go. Another very strong monster indeed. Otherwise, in the living tank categories, maybe the Barbed and Scythed Hierodulls are worth a mention as well. They're the bigger Forge World ones, and these basically feel like a Tyrannifex but bigger and more melee capable. Probably a bit more of a mixed role threat rather than a dedicated gun beast, but again I'd say that they're fairly similar to the Tyrannifex in what they do for the cost. For their cultist allies, we've got the Genestealer Cults, and again really they're perhaps a faction that only really has one tank in the Goliath Rock Grinder at 155. I suppose if you wanted some guard armour, you could ally some Brood Brothers, though I feel like they might be more tempted to go for things like the artillery, as opposed to the direct fire armour for the most part. For vehicles in this codex, the Ridge Runner might be a little bit better due to debuffing a target with an extra AP -1, really quite big for neophyte seismic cannon shooting there, but at the same time I'd say it doesn't really feel quite as much of a tank compared with this thing. The Goliath I'd rate as a fairly fragile but also fairly dangerous transport tank. It's only toughness 10, a 3+ save and 10 wounds, which is less than you might hope for I think. It does transport 6 models though, with firing deck 6, so you could throw some demo charges out of it or something. It comes with either a mining laser for some anti-tank action, or a heavy incinerator to threaten some overwatch and clear some infantry, and quite a nice demo cache charge that it has on board as well. A whole bunch of fairly powerful shots, though you have to get quite close at 6-inch range. Then it's also got a stubber, and some fairly solid combat with that drill dozer blade. Strength 10, AP -2 and damage 2 is at least fairly good against most targets. It also averages around 3 mortal wounds and impact hits as well. I feel like this thing gets passed up quite a lot due to it not respawning and maybe not playing quite as much into the core playstyle of the Genestealer Cults, and might have some issues getting close to the targets it really wants to get to. I kind of think that it could be an interesting enough choice for a rapid ingress unit maybe, perhaps turning up in an annoying place from strategic reserve and hopefully can't be shot down in the same turn, and then it can move forward, fire the demo charges at close range and proceed to charge, Hopefully getting a full turn of damage output out of this guy could be worth it. Next up for the Leagues of Votann, I guess the choice will be between the Sagittor or the Hexatron Land Fortress, both of which I think are usable, though I'd say the Hexatron is probably the stronger overall. It's got a similar sort of toughness to a Landvader with toughness 12, a 2+ save and 16 wounds. It's covered in a bunch of guns, and it's got access to judgment tokens to buff them for a +1 to hit and wound in shooting if you can get the tokens where they need to be. Plus it's perhaps one of the better choices for the stratagem for 1 command point for sustained hits to shooting. They also have a return fire 1 for 2 command points against an enemy unit as well. When he gets shot, just shoot straight back with a whole load of guns on a big tough tank. Most of the time it'll be ignoring cover with that scanner pack, which I think more people would take over the rocket launch, and that'll help out its primary armament and its collection of bolt cannons and auto cannons for some good backup fire. For the main gun, I'd say that all of them are okay, though I might be most tempted by the big hit or miss Magna Rail cannon. It's got a reasonable chance of killing vehicles in a single shot if the hit does convert, though it is very risky and swingy, and it has heavy for a ballistic skill 3+ if stationary. The other two are maybe a little bit more general purpose, and I think are fine enough, and maybe a little bit less all or nothing. Finally, it's got a transport capacity, where the unit inside can get out and then reroll some wounds when it's shooting the enemy. Might be okay for the Drukhari Thunderkin with the grav cannons. A unit of 3 getting some rerolls there could be kind of nice. It could just be something to deliver Hearthkin or Chthonian Berserks onto objectives and into close range with the enemy. I think usable enough within the faction, though at the moment Leagues of Votann generally have a fair few overcosted units. They could certainly have a lot of stuff go down in points, I think. For Necrons, I'd give it to the Fearsome Doomsday arc. This thing's had a real about face from 9th edition, where it was just notoriously unreliable. D6 shots could get you very few, D6 damage could let you down there hard as well, and if it ever had to move then the damage output falls off a cliff. Now though, it's certainly very strong Necron anti-tank firepower, competing well with things like the Locust Heavy Destroyers, and the cannon's just more reliable all around. D6+1 attacks, strength 15, AP -4 and damage 4, and it gets that even if it moves as well, and then just gets some further bonuses if it does manage to stay still, a +1 to hit with heavy, and devastating wounds for some big damage on 6s. Putting that all together, it just becomes a very frightening anti-tank weapon indeed, and it pairs that with what I'd say is a fairly good defense at toughness 9, a 3+ save with a 4+ invulnerable, and a big 14 wounds. Not that easy to kill with traditional anti-tank weapons with the good invulnerable. And if enemy infantry does close the distance, it's got some backup Gauss flares with a whole bunch of anti-infantry shots with lethal hits. Otherwise, for Necron armour, I think the monolith is worth a mention as well. Really quite a durable centerpiece with some pretty devastating firepower between the particle whip and death rays. It's got some infantry teleportation shenanigans, and even some surprisingly okay melee with the Portal of Exile. Ghost Arcs are definitely more transports than tanks, though can be nice for their reactive reanimation shenanigans. Yet another piece that can make a Necron warrior or Lichguard blob just frighteningly hard to take down. For the Tau, I think that their armoured options are actually really quite well balanced at the moment between the Skyray, Hammerhead and Longstrike. I'd perhaps rate all of them a little bit subpar compared with some of the battlesuits right now. Broadsides, I think, are maybe slightly better direct damage dealers, if a bit slower. Ghost kills have the big advantage of not being able to be shot from long range, so definitely troubling for a lot of enemy armies to try and kill. And Buff's Crisis suits with cyclic Ion Blaster spam seems good for just general purpose bodying the enemy. Despite those good contenders, I'd still say that they're usable enough. All sort of middling defense with medium toughness but quite a few wounds, and the usual Tau shooting rules where they can get guided for a 3+ to hit, and then some extra big damage when they get to Cowie on turn 3. Out of the tank chassis, the Skyray is 160 points and opens up with a bunch of strength 14 Seeker missiles with anti-fly. They get some nice accelerated burst cannons for secondary weapon fire as well. The Hammerhead's a fair bit cheaper and either has the general purpose ion cannon or the really big shot with the railgun, again very all or nothing against enemy tanks, plus 2 Seeker missiles which it could help out with the Alpha Strike. Finally there's Long Strike, which is like a Hammerhead with a few extra benefits, 170 points for ballistic skill 3+ base, plus giving a Hammerhead lethal hits. Not the most enormous buff in the world, but it could make an ion cannon really quite general purpose, punching up against heavy hitters a lot more efficiently than it would otherwise. Overall, I'd say that they're all fine, if not absolutely enormously exciting. Fish of Fury might work still to some extent. You could back it up with some Devilfish with some breaches in. Finally, for the Orks, I'd give the prize to the Battle Wagon. In 10th edition, Orcs seem to be all about the charging into melee with a Goth style buff on their clan bonus, plus the War helps out combat things far more than it does any shooting things, and there's no option for a speed War these days. For raw shooting firepower, perhaps things like the mech guns might be one of the best. They don't really tend to do range tanks all that much, but the battle wagon I think is still pretty usable, with now really quite a lot of guns that it gets for free, plus delivering some boys into the thick of the action. The battle wagon is toughness 10 with a 3+ save and 16 wounds, a 6+ invulnerable, and a really quite nice rule to worsen enemy AP by 1. Very nice if you can tow it into cover somehow. It also can be toughness 12 if you really want to go all in on the durability. You'd sacrifice the firing deck for that, but I guess that kind of depends on what you're transporting. If it's just regular boys or knobs, then you probably don't care all that much, and the toughness 12 will be far more valuable. Then it does come with a whole bunch of guns, a kill cannon at strength 9, AP 2 and damage 2, a lobber or a zapper, some big shooters, and then in combat it's got the death roller, a grabbing claw and wrecking ball, which now give you extra attacks. Could be interesting enough with a bit of tank shock on the go as well. Then it's got a big transport capacity that you could put a large mob of say beast snagger boys or orc knobs in maybe. Definitely a fairly sturdy way of delivering something important to the front line, maybe alongside some very cheap and efficient trucks. Otherwise, for competitors for Orky armour, there's a bunch of things that I probably don't think are top tier optimal for Orcs, but still usable enough. The Forge World Kill Tank has got a fairly scary gun that hits on 4 when it's up close. The Kill Rig's fairly similar in utility to the Battle Wagon, they're locked to just the Beast Snaggers. I think Grot Tanks are worth a mention as well, they do have really quite a lot of wounds on the table, and some ballistic skill 4+ shooting. They could soak up at least a fair amount of enemy fire, and perhaps even the Gargantuan Squiggoth if you count it. Much more of a melee transport beast in reality, though definitely a rival for the Battle Wagon's role. So anyway, with that done, that brings us to the end of our look at Warhammer 40k's tanks and a few other big stompy damage dealers along the way as well. For just a very rough take on best overall, I feel like it might be the Aeldari Fire Prism just for raw value. Big damage, enormous rerolls, and some massive tricks to allow it to stay safe are pretty hard to beat I think, plus the flexibility to act in a very different way if you happen to be against hordes. Otherwise, if you're counting it as a leggy tank, then the Forged Fiend probably would get second place for me I think. Really quite a lot of cool synergy that you can do with those, and pretty massive power with things like the Nurgle Mark and the Chaos Undivided Mark, if you can spare them a stratagem or two here or there. Otherwise, for stronger options, I quite like the Necron Doomsday Arc, the Gladiator Lancer and the Caladius tank, and while they're certainly not properly tanks, just for things that were mentioned on the list, both the Muselith Vortex Beast and Wardog Brigand are pretty cool big tough range damage dealers, maybe operating in a pretty similar role for their factions. Let me know what you think though, which would you rate as the strongest tanks in Warhammer 40k? Look forward to hearing all your thoughts down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and that's the thing that allows me to keep on making so many videos like this quite so regularly. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early each week, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.